This would be a huge cost to science of destroying a pristine lunar environment.
Appropriately enough, in a flatland.
In my opinion, Sagan breached security in March 1959 when he revealed the ARF's classified projects.
This is the story of Project A119, the top-secret US plan to nuke the moon, and the scientists that almost made it real. The United States and Soviet Russia were locked in the depths of the Cold War. Both superpowers had been constructing nuclear arsenals at faster and faster rates. Both were ready to obliterate the other at the sign of a single launch or even the threat of one, really. So the world was held in a terrifying, uneasy balance, outright war being so destructive that both superpowers opted instead for a conflict of espionage, proxy wars, and a race to conquer space. By the end of the 1950s, that space race had only just begun, but Soviet Russia had completely outstripped the United States. They had achieved the first launch of an ICBM, the first satellite in space, first animal in orbit, first flyby of the moon. Meanwhile, the US had managed to achieve the first solar-powered satellite, but otherwise was clearly, unmistakably behind. In a conflict of potential nuclear war, though, you might wonder why the space race was important at all. Well, unlike the rest of the conflict, the space race was visible. Sure, America had far more nuclear weapons than Russia, but that was entirely top secret, and so neither the Soviet or American public had any way of knowing that. All those populations could really see was Soviet supremacy written in the stars above them and orbiting the Earth in satellites. So how should America show its prominence, its power, its superiority? This was the question asked by the US government and top members of the US military, and the answer to some members of the US Air Force was simple. The US needed to detonate a nuclear warhead on the moon.
Would you sing the goodbye song with us?
I would love to, Bear.
It also had to be visible to the public with the naked eye, but the US Air Force was worried about a negative public reaction. People might object to, randomly bombing the moon. So this massive nuclear explosion couldn't be seen as just destructive. There had to be some scientific reason used to justify it. The problem? Well, there wasn't any. No scientist had asked for this, so in 1958, the US military recruited a team of top scientists tasked with an unprecedented mission. Find out how we can nuke the moon, and then find a reason for us to actually do it. Under strict secrecy, a team was assembled to work at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. The effort was led by Leonard Rifle. He had worked with Enrico Fermi, had patented over 50 different inventions, and had been a part of developing an early prototype of a railgun. Now, he was tasked with running a team to find justification for striking the moon, even though Rifle had made clear his reservations to the US Air Force that
this would be a huge cost to science, destroying a pristine lunar environment.
But this objection wasn't remotely important to the US Air Force. As Rifle put it,
this didn't seem of concern to our sponsors.
After all,
the main aim of the proposed detonation was a PR exercise and a show of one-upsmanship. The Air Force wanted a mushroom cloud so large it would be visible on Earth.
Rifle's concerns were irrelevant, and so following orders, he pushed forwards. Realizing they needed expertise on planetary physics, he asked for the advice of Gerard Kuiper. Bringing Kuiper on was a risk, even as an advisor. He was an incredibly accomplished, but also an incredibly difficult man to deal with. Kuiper had been born with eyesight around 4 times sharper than the average humans, allowing him to see stars emitting far less light in the night sky than really any of us. His fascination with space and his intellect led him to discovery after discovery. By the time Rifle asked Kuiper's advice, he had correctly predicted the atmospheric composition of Mars, that Saturn's rings were made of ice, he had discovered multiple moons of other planets, and had proven that Mars's polar ice caps were made of frozen water and not of CO2. But he was also described by others as authoritarian and as very difficult to work for or even to be in the same building with. So who could actually manage to work with Kuiper? I believe there were very few people that could tolerate being with Kuiper. Carl Sagan, Dale Cruikshank, Bill Hartman, me, Toby Owen. Wait a second, what was that first name?
We're about to begin a journey through the cosmos.
Consider again that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us.
While we cannot imagine.
Yes, that Carl Sagan. In 1959, Carl Sagan was a PhD student of Kuiper and actually managed to impress him. Kuiper was, in fact, so impressed by Sagan that he advised Rifle to hire him for Project A119. And Rifle agreed. And so Sagan began work modelling the expansion of an exploding dust cloud from a direct nuclear blast on the moon. Sagan even tried to find justification for the effort as a, perhaps drastic, way of testing if there was organic molecules on the moon. Over 1959, the team published a series of secret reports. The plan was to strike the moon with a 1.7 kiloton bomb aimed at hitting the night side of the Terminator. In other words, on the very edge of the dark side of the moon. This would blow a dust cloud large enough and in the right location for the sun's light to illuminate it. A cloud large enough and lit with enough intensity to be visible from Earth. By the way, it's tempting here to think that the plan was just a mad moment of Cold War fears from the United States, but we now know, thanks to a discovery of documents in Russia, that the Soviets had planned basically the exact same thing in 1958. The Soviets even actually started building the launch vehicle for the project. The US, it seems, never actually got this far. Sometime in 1959, for reasons unknown, the plan was abandoned and buried in secret, never to be heard of again. But if that's true, then how is this even a video at all? This is not a top secret government leak. This is not what I'm doing, not what I'm doing. You see, Carl Sagan was a great communicator of scientific ideas, and he just loved to talk about them. Specifically, in this case, when researching his biography, Sagan's application for academic scholarships at Berkeley were discovered. In those scholarship applications, Sagan had discussed his work on Project A119 and named a total of 8 papers published as a part of the research, all of which were top secret and all of which were destroyed, it turns out, in 1987. Well, all of which bar one. You see, following the release of his biography, a Freedom of Information request was lodged to find more information about Project A119, and this resulted in the declassified release of the only document we have to prove the project existed. Volume 1 of the innocuously titled A Study of Lunar Research Flights. The plan had been entirely buried, but Sagan had accidentally managed to let the entire world know. And Rifle, when he found out in the mid to late 90s, was pretty furious.
I did not know until the biographies were published that Sagan had sent an unclassified by whom manuscript about his work on A119 to any unauthorized person, let alone 5 people.
In case there was any doubt, Rifle ended his statement.
In my opinion, Sagan breached security in March 1959.
So while we know very little about the project, we know far more than we were ever actually meant to. After the closure of Project A119, Rifle went to work with NASA, consulting on the possibility of life on the moon, and eventually working to popularize science on radio and TV. Kuiper also moved on to further work on the moon, most notably identifying the actual landing sites for the Apollo missions, whereas Sagan, of course, became one of the most famous science communicators to have ever lived, was a pioneer for the search for extraterrestrial life, an advocate for the exploration of space, and, eventually, campaigned for full nuclear disarmament. But briefly, in the first half of 1959, in secret, in the depths of Chicago, the fears and threats of Cold War drove them all to work on a plan so unbelievably mad that it'd be easy to dismiss it as nonsense if we didn't have the document to prove it.